much. Give me 1 second, pull up the presentation here. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Thanks, Annie, for the intro. My name is Craig Hageland. I'm with the US EPA and the Commercial Buildings Program with Energy Star. I'm responsible for a number of our sectors, commercial real estate, multifamily, data centers, as well as our tenant initiatives. So really excited to be here today to talk about tenant engagement. This is one of my sort of favorite topics. We do a webinar on this topic every few years or so, and I think we do that because it's really dynamic and changing. There's new tenants in place that are coming up with their own sustainability goals, their own carbon reduction goals. They want access to data. They have different sort of requirements and interests that they can discuss with the landlord. Not to mention, the SEC ruling that's out there that is at the very least sort of piqued public companies' interests on being able to get a hand of carbon accounting. So, those needs are constantly changing, as well as landlords and owners are developing their own goals. And it's really hard. It's really difficult. I think our panelists will probably agree there isn't a silver magic bullet that works with all tenants. Tenants have different personalities, different goals of their own. Not to mention, tenants are in different parts of the country for owners with large portfolios, different leasing terms, different asset classes. So our goal today is to talk about some of these differences. We actually have a couple webinars this week. If you saw the sort of intro slide, today we're focusing sort of on non-residential, even though a couple of our panelists do have multifamily in their portfolio, but we're looking at office, industrial, retail, others, really dealing with sort of your corporate commercial tenant and how to engage with them. So looking forward to the discussion. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Elena Alschuler with LaSalle Investment Management, who's the America's Head of Sustainability. We have Karen Marus, who's the Senior Vice President and Head of ESG at Clarion Partners. And we have Lauren Moss, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at Vornado. Welcome, you three. Thanks for joining us. So to kick things off, we'll have our panelists give a brief background on their organizations to sort of set us up here, and then we'll dive into the discussion. All right, Elena, I think you are up first.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. Just a little overview of who we are at LaSalle. We're one of the world's largest real estate-only investment managers with about 80 billion under management globally, about half of that in the US. And we invest across all asset classes. So that's office, medical office, multifamily, a lot of open air, grocery anchor retail, industrial distribution, and single family homes, and all the other unique things that are out there. So we have to take, sort of figure out our strategies across all of those asset classes. Next slide, please. Just wanted to share kind of how we approach thinking about decarbonization. Essentially, we start from the position that sustainability and climate risk can be material to the financial performance of an asset, whether that's tenant demand, regulatory impacts, physical climate risk like floods and hurricanes. The impact might vary by asset, but we have to always look at it. And so we try to integrate it throughout our investment strategy and think about a tailored approach to maximizing the value and minimizing risk at each asset. And we work towards a scope 1 and 2 net zero goal within that framework. Next slide, please. So when we talk about coming up with a tailored approach for each asset, we're looking across all these buckets. I think those of you that work in sustainability, none of these should be a surprise. These are kind of the building blocks of a sustainability plan. But what we do is we have a one-page part of each asset's annual business plan that is dedicated to sustainability, and it has all of these categories in it. And you'll see, goals and regulations, completed progress to date, data coverage, technical assessments, operational and capital activities, renewables, tenant community engagement, which is what we're talking about today, any physical climate risk that we've identified. So we're making sure that we're checking this for every single asset every year and updating the plan. So that's kind of a high-level intro to how we approach it at LaSalle, and I'll hand it off to my next colleague.
All right, thanks. Karen, I think you're up.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on the call today, and thank you all for attending. Looking forward to a great discussion. My name again is Karen Maroos, Clarion Partners. A little bit of background. We are also pure play real estate investment manager with about 40 years of experience and approximately 80 billion in assets under management. We have about 1,500 properties throughout the US and Europe. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'll really spend a lot of time talking about our industrial logistics warehouse portfolio. We have approximately, 1,000 assets, 230 million square feet of space in that sector. And I think it makes for an interesting conversation when we talk about tenant engagement. And if we go to the next slide, a little bit about our sustainability program. I'm just going to focus on our net zero commitment for this slide. So we have a net zero by 2050 goal for all landlord controlled areas, scope 1 and 2 emissions. In each of these buckets, we have activities, projects, initiatives, and plans that are helping us get towards our net zero goal. I have kind of encapsulated a few buckets here where we especially coordinate with our tenants and highlighted a few of the initiatives that I'll be talking about today in some of these drop-down boxes. I won't take too much time on that right now because it will come up in the conversation, but where we spend a lot of time engaging with our tenants is around, finding the places where we can partner on shared goals and opportunities to reduce costs and reduce risk. So with that, I will turn it over. I think Lauren's next.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be participating in this conversation. So Vornado we are the smallest of the bunch here. We are about a total of 34 million square feet across our portfolio, mostly commercial office buildings. You can see we have a variety of different properties, but we will focus in really on our commercial office buildings, of which the Penn District has been a clear focus for us recently. We're mostly in and around New York City. We have one asset in Chicago and one one major property in San Francisco, but the work that we do is really commercial office, mostly multi-tenant buildings. Next slide, please. Our sustainability program, we've committed to a carbon neutrality goal. We're going to go into more detail within the presentation and this discussion. By 2030, we call that Vision 2030. It is SBTI aligned. We have a variety of goals, 100% LEED certification for our office portfolio by 2024, which we are at about 97% right now. We also have goals around waste management and procurement, water reduction, etc. So we'll go into more details into what specifics make up our carbon neutrality goal in the next set of questions, though.
Great. Well, thank you three for covering that. So there's, not only to sort of give you some background on our speakers, but I think, one key element where to sort of start the conversation when talking about tenant engagement is where do tenants fit into the picture, right? In terms of your overall goals. You have your corporate goals, you have, those change and you base that on your portfolio, sort of upper level management sort of directives, investors, but then you have tenants who may have similar goals, may have different goals. So let's dive a little bit more into that tenant engagement piece and sort of tease out where they fit and how you bring them along to help you meet your goals. And let's continue going with Lauren. Love to hear a little bit more about your tenant engagement, sort of specific goals around that.
Sure. So our carbon neutrality goal, or Vision 2030, is encompassing of our tenant energy consumption. So when we look at scope 1 and scope 2, our scope 2 includes tenant electric load, which we submeter about 95% of our tenants. So we have the data on our tenants, and I understand probably to many people, we are a very lucky bunch because we have all of that data and we can look at it and really use it to help us understand our buildings. But what we use that for is when we created our carbon neutrality goal of the first tenet of carbon neutrality for us is a 50% reduction in consumption. across our portfolio. And of that 50%, we have assigned 45% of that to our tenants. Meaning when I look at how we create decarbonization planning in our buildings, in and across our portfolio, we are required to engage with our tenants and to drive their consumption down. Now, there's a benefit to that, which is a direct result of cost savings for the tenants as they're sub-metered. So they're benefiting immediately from any reduction in consumption. But it does mean that we have to look at our tenants' sub-meter usage, not just our base building load, especially since tenants typically in a multi-tenant commercial office building drive about 65% of the overall load, but we really have to work with our tenants. So what we do is almost the same way when you benchmark across a portfolio, you're sort of looking for outliers to try and understand why those buildings aren't performing the way they might. We actually start to drill down into our buildings and we use the sub-meter data to look for those outliers, right? We're starting to look at occupancy, we're looking at tenants' sub-meter load, and then we're literally engaging with those tenants to try and understand whether it means that we end up then showing them a part of our BMS so that they can understand what we're providing them with in exchange for us being able to actually see what they're doing to control their systems so that we can really work with them almost as, I want to say, partners, and we become sort of their consultants, right? And how they use their space to really identify opportunities for savings. And while at the same time, we're making sure that they understand that anything that they do within their space, they'll see in their bill directly. So like I say, it's like when you tell your kids to turn off your lights at home, right? We're working with our tenants in the same way and trying to drive that same behavior change. So that's the biggest piece of the work that we do because of the amount of reduction we are really trying to drive in our portfolio, solely looking at our tenants for almost half of our consumption reduction. There's a lot of other things, but I think we'll keep going and I'm going to pass it on.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Sort of clear that there's a direct tie between your goals, what you're requiring of the tenants for your own goals, and then, really takes sort of close relationships to be able to understand your tenants and where you can sort of move forward with them. Interested to hear from Karen, looking at industrial. Imagine it's a little bit different of what you're dealing with tenants there, but want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. It is a little bit different when I hear Lauren talk about kind of the way, like how closely they work together with their tenants and how easily accessible the data is. I certainly have, I'm inspired. But yes, it is different, unlike what Lauren was just saying, we obviously have a lot less control over our tenant, spaces, over the most of the building space, especially in industrial. We typically have a very small percentage that the landlord controls. And, another point, which I think is embedded a little bit in what Lauren was saying, is that we also, if assets are not sitting in kind of some of these key urban core markets where there's building performance standards, we have less of that kind of, outward pressure that can drive both us and the tenant at the same time. But what we have found is that a lot of our tenants do have, similar goals, or they have their own stakeholder pressures that are driving their sustainability programs, net zero goals. They're looking for energy efficiency measures to partner on. They're looking for renewables to partner on. They're looking for their data too. So there is quite a lot to still partner on. And, our stance is really that it will take all parties to achieve these aggressive decarbonization goals that all of our companies have in place. It's not just the landlord that can do it. It is the tenant that controls a lot of the energy, but it's also utilities, it's technologies that even some that probably don't exist yet that we will need in order to hit these aggressive net zero targets. So it really does take all parties. The other thing I'll mention on kind of why we engage with our tenants is one thing we've seen is although this doesn't happen as much in the US, we're seeing a lot of push from our tenants in Europe to have our assets meet certain criteria or have certain initiatives or certain opportunities in place for them in order for them to want to lease out, and that's again because they have very aggressive goals themselves. So, you know, we anticipate that that type of push will also evolve into other markets. But that certainly is something that's a driver for us too. And then lastly, I'll just say, you know, we see partnering with our tenants also as an engagement tool, because so many of them do have goals in place and their own robust sustainability programs. You know, quite frankly, we'd be laggards in the space if we didn't have the capability to partner with them on certain initiatives.
Sure, great, thanks. Elena, how about LaSalle? How are you building out your tenant engagement program? How does that tie into sort of your overall goals?
Sure. So scope 3 is not an explicit part of our overall goal because, you know, from LaSalle's position, we don't want to have a goal that encompasses things that we can't fully control, even though our ambition is still to influence and partner. And so I think it ends up looking very much the same in practice to folks that do have that goal. You know, we think our tenants probably are about half of our scope 3 is probably about half of our carbon impact. And we're continually working on better metering and better assigning meters to tenants or sub-metering tenants so that we can get even better clarity across, on that across our portfolio. But we really see tenants as key partners in our business, right? Attracting and retaining high quality tenants is material to the success of our properties. And sustainability is increasingly important to them. There was a JLL study a year or two ago that estimated that 70% of corporate occupiers will have a net zero goal by 2025. And that actually is across big box retail, industrial, like not just office, right? And we're starting to see that actually in those other asset classes. And then we're also seeing, as I think some of my colleagues mentioned, increasing both regulations at the state and local level, as well as we're watching the potential SEC disclosure requirements and SFDR in Europe at the federal level. And so that doesn't, you know, require working with tenants. So for all of those reasons, we think it's really important to be working with tenants and supporting them in their goals. And the way that we really break it out is that if we look at multi-tenant buildings, so that would really be office, multifamily, and some of our retail centers that have a lot of tenants in them. And we approach them in a slightly different way because we have property managers on site. We have control of some of the core building systems, and we're engaging with the tenants and maintaining the property a lot more. And then we have a slightly different strategy for our big triple net lease, like the similar situation to what Karen was just describing, where it's a triple net lease property where the tenant has full control of the building, whether that's industrial or big box retail, where we really need to be doing a much more customized approach. But in either case, and I know we'll sort of get into these categories, but we kind of roughly break it into data sharing, communications, projects that we do together, and then activities around leasing and fit out. And then that's sort of customized a little bit by asset class, or whether it's triple net versus multi-tenant.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think that certainly tees up our discussion later as we get into the sort of life cycle of a tenant and when you engage them, and we'll get into some of those details. But I think the underlying theme, is that at the very least, tenants are paying attention to this stuff, whether it's coming from Europe or it's just sort of corporate goals that are starting to filter down to individual tenant spaces. So step one is sort of awareness, having an idea of what's going on, getting your goals sort of aligned. The next step, of course, is implementation and how you're actually doing this. So I wanted to sort of ask around again, what are the first steps here? Where do you go first? You have your plans. Is it sort of the shotgun approach, apply a similar sort of onboarding concept to everyone, all tenants, or are you being more targeted in which tenants you're sort of bringing on board? Start with Karen, just because I think you have a unique perspective from your portfolio where you're limited in some ways. So how are you approaching sort of implementing and engaging tenants sort of on a basis of the individual tenant?
Yeah, sure. Obviously in the industrial assets, we have, again, little to no landlord control. So I guess I can answer this question two ways. One, the first way we partner with tenants is, of course, those that have kind of the largest footprint across our portfolio and have the shared goals. We working with those tenants makes sense because they are, large scale, they're willing participants, they're eager to achieve their own goals. It just makes it easier, quite frankly, to do. And especially in single tenant buildings where they control the whole asset. The other way to think about this is we really can't go anywhere until we have some data. And so one of the biggest challenges for us is still just capturing the data. And, I know we'll kind of talk about data a little later in this conversation, but that is one area where we're really focused on, as well as a few other kind of very accretive, low-hanging fruit energy efficiency programs that are in many markets and many assets, no brainers, because the returns are so good for both, for the landlord and the tenant, things like LED lighting. Those are the easiest and first opportunities for us. And there's still plenty of room in kind of this bucket of initiatives that I would say are kind of more accretive and add real value to the asset that's quantifiable.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, Lauren, Elena, other thoughts there? Elena, maybe you have your asset level plans that you're trying to apply everywhere. Does that apply to every tenant and the same sort of tenant engagement approach, or is it dependent on the tenant, where they are and sort of their own goals?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we ask each asset manager and property team to think about, right? There's a box there that says, what are you doing for tenant and community engagement? So they have to think about that, and they also have to look at their data coverage. So data coverage is usually first and foremost, like let's share data with each other, and whether that's through green lease or just asking nicely. Sometimes the asking nicely approach, especially because we're often acquiring stabilized buildings, you don't have that lease renewal or leasing moment to make the request. So that's really where we like to start with people. And then, it does vary by asset class. So, with the multi-tenant properties like multifamily and office, it's a little bit more of a broad brush approach of offering opportunities to everybody or providing resources to everybody. Whereas with the big box retail and triple net industrial, we've done some internet sleuthing, first of all, to look at, as Karen said, who are the biggest tenants in our portfolio. And we do have some tenants that have multiple million square feet with us across multiple properties in the US. And so, if you rank them by size and then you do some internet sleuthing and see who has sustainability goals or ahead of sustainability, that's kind of our easiest place to start. And a lot of times we find that like a LinkedIn message to the right person or an introduction through a colleague to the head of sustainability or to whoever's in charge of energy procurement or someone a little more senior in the company, it's often a more effective entry point for those big tenants than going to the facility manager on site who's like running the equipment in that triple net lease property every day, because they have their hands full and they often don't feel empowered to make those decisions. They're happy to execute, but they have no idea how to raise it up the chain themselves, right? And it's not part of their day-to-day job description. So it's much more helpful actually to engage at the more senior level, and then they can help empower the people at the site to work with us.
Yeah, super interesting. And I mean, it's seems obvious, but it's not obvious. Like you need to do your research, you need to find the decision makers, and then filter down. But every location may be different. So working with that cycle is, got to be challenging. So Lauren, with Vornado, where you're mostly office, mostly New York based, do you have a similar approach where you sort of wean it out, or do you have a more general approach because have a little bit more homogenous, I guess, mixture of tenants there?
I mean, what I would say is we want every tenant to care. So we take the approach of sort of broad communication through the property managers to every tenant, but also what Elena was saying is very true, which is typically the people in the building operating the space at that moment in time are not necessarily empowered to make the kinds of decisions. So the other thing that we have done is really look at our largest tenants across the portfolio and really work to create relationships with the people there that are responsible for their own programs, right? Typically large organizations at this point have some sort of public statement. So what we're trying to do is understand that statement. We've created a database of it so that when we go and we have conversations, we're trying to align the work we're doing with what they're doing. And I think what we're all seeing, I assume, is a lot of requests from tenants now on carbon emissions, on consumption, on structure of the building, the kinds of utilities in the buildings, that actually what kinds of, not just the certifications, but what kind of programming or long-term goals we have in place. And so as we get those requests, we start to then have these conversations around, we can give you this information, but we'd also love to come talk to you about how we move forward with that with you, right? And we're lucky also in New York, we have a great partner in NYSERDA, a great partner in Con Edison. So we usually can come with some money for them also. And that seems to be really helpful, right?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly sounds like a similar journey that, we had with Portfolio Manager, where the largest sort of organizations, they're working with some properties and then they get all their properties involved. And that sort of led to sort of the movement that we're seeing today with benchmarking. Would make sense that we'd see something similar, as there's best practices that are built around tenants and implementing their initiatives, and others can follow. Very interesting. So I want to get a little bit more specific into the different times that you engage with the tenants, and we all thought it would make sense to sort of frame it as like a leasing life cycle. So let's start with leasing. So if you've sort of done your research and you have a plan of how to proceed, I was wondering if we could discuss a little bit about leasing. I know green leasing, the concept has been around for a long time, but I think there's been a little bit of a shift where instead of this one green lease off to the side that is sort of offered after the fact, maybe we're getting more into boilerplate language that includes green language, and it's no longer a sort of a green lease, it's just your lease, and then you have these things sort of built in as sort of your practice with the business. But I'll stop. I want to hear from you all. How are you approaching leasing? What are those conversations and relationships like? What types of things do you accomplish during the leasing process that sort of sets yourself up for success? And feel free to, bring in examples of challenging leases and unique leases that, the tenant has other things in mind, and how you, might have overcome with that. So can open up to anyone. Why don't we start with Lauren, if you want to talk about leasing.
Yeah. I mean, I really believe we have to start looking at tenants like we look at buildings with a full life cycle, where you start from the moment of engagement, because that is actually when major decisions are made, right? So I would say in all of our leases, we have a green lease clause. We don't call it a green lease clause, we just call it sort of a CapEx investment clause or something. I mean, there's some technical term for it. And the interesting thing about that is it's really hyper focused on CapEx, right? So it's only about the investments that we make in the building, and that we can then amortize over the term of a lease if it positively impacts the tenant. So then it's a question of, how do you get the tenants to make the right investments in their space, not just us in our base building systems, right? So we in New York also now have the local law 97 lease clause, which is creating huge amounts of feedback and growth in the New York market around, what is a tenant's responsibility versus the owner's responsibility. It also reiterates the need and requirement for submetering. We also have a submetering law, but it for us has really demonstrated the need to be able to show tenants the consumption that they are driving in the building with their submeter, and also their allocated PAM usage, to then show them how they perform against local law 97, so we can start to engage in discussions around, nobody wants a fine for 97. None of us want to say that we have these broad, far-reaching goals that we're working so hard to achieve, and at the end of the day, we're seeing a fine. So I think there's this sort of green leasing clause. We see this local law 97 clause, which I imagine will get much broader as we move, into more regulation across the country. And then we've done things like we've changed our tenant fit out guides. So the requirement around tenant fit outs for us, we took as an opportunity to drive a stretch code. compliance. And the harder part there was actually training our consulting MEPs that review the design submissions from the tenants, right? To get them to understand that they had to look at the tenant space differently. They really had to look at the tenant space as what's today most efficient, but what will maintain efficiency over time. That has a lot to do with putting in lighting controls, plug load controls, being able to look at BMS and share the BMS screens for the supplemental equipment so that we can understand what's happening. So we've done a lot of that work around really not just looking at how do we work with the brokers, how do we work with the lawyers, how do we work with the design and construction team, and then once the tenants are on board, how we're using the sub-meter data that we get to really make sure that they're performing the way that they intended to perform.
Great. Yeah. No, very interesting to think of how you frame that, you know, especially with local law 97, having that to specifically point to and say, we're all sort of in the same boat here. Let's focus around the targets and what we need to do to be able to meet that makes it a little bit more tangible. Elena, what about LaSalle? You're a little bit more spread out. I'm sure you have properties in New York that are dealing with that as well, but from a leasing standpoint and what's going into that, what are your sort of your current engagements like with tenants?
Yeah, so we also have green lease clauses, and what we found is rather than having it be like a section in the lease that says like here's the green lease clauses with like a bunch of clauses there, we actually have it built into the relevant sections throughout the lease, and that helps a lot in getting the tenant buy-in. So for example, like capital cost recovery, there's already a whole section about that. So you really only need to add a few words to make sure that it includes, you know, capital expenditures related to sustainability and how that's going to be handled. So we've had a lot more success doing it that way. The core pieces of our lease really have to do with data sharing, the capital cost recovery, the BPS fine recovery. Basically says, you know, we want them to work with us for any certifications, and things like that. And you know, the truth is like the lease is really it sort of, how do I say this? It sort of sets the table, or sets the basis for the conversation. But the truth is, you're probably not going to do some major project without engaging with your tenant and talking to them about it. So it's really just kind of sort of setting the principles for how you're going to work together. And then, you know, we sort of deal with it on a one-off basis. So for example, we just did a lease renewal at a property in DC. They started asking some questions about the sustainability in the building, and we realized that actually that tenant was not sub-metered. And so we said, great, let's sub-meter you as part of our lease renewal. It'll be fabulous for both of us. And they were actually very happy because it will free them up to do green power procurement and better reporting for their sustainability goals, and also help us, and actually better aligns the landlord-tenant relationship. So we're just looking for those opportunities sort of as they come up in major leases.
Great. Yeah, certainly data sharing, finding those opportunities to get sub-meter data in there. That's first part, sort of managing and measuring it. And I'm sure we'll have more to say on data in a few minutes. But Karen, I imagine that with, you know, industrial portfolio, certainly the access to data is just as not as much, if not more of an issue. Is that something you focus on in leases? Are you including some of these other things? Do you have any other sort of thoughts around that?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of it got covered, especially by what Elena said. Obviously, our lease language varies by sector, industrial different than retail, different than office, et cetera. But yes, I mean, even in the industrial sector, we definitely do have, you know, what we might call green lease language. A lot of the things that Elena mentioned, we also include some, in some cases, we include some efficiency standards like water, equipment, best practices, and things like that. But, you know, very similar, data sharing is obviously a key component. I know some of my peers on this call also have been recognized, but we're proud to continue to be recognized as green lease leaders. So we do definitely try to, you know, also continuously improve our lease language as the world changes, and as our program changes. I will say, you know, I know we'll talk a little bit more about especially with data collection, kind of what other options there are.
Mhm.
I think for a long time as an industry, we've said, just throw the green lease language in and then all our issues are solved. But I think what we've also found is that from a practical perspective, green lease language allows us to do certain things, but it also, there's a lot more to it. Like once we have data sharing clauses in our leases, we then have to actually have the manpower and the tracking capabilities and all of those things to go out and collect that data and make sure it's accurate. So I think, I think leasing is a key component, but there's also so much more that goes into the ability to actually drive these programs forward. And I just think we have to pull a lot more, that is a foundational piece, and then we have to layer in a lot more levers that we can pull on top of that.
Great. Yeah. And I think we'll touch a little bit more on data in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
But first, I want to get to sort of, I guess I call it the middle phase, but it's the longest phase. It's the occupancy. Tenant actually moves in. You have a lease in place. Certainly the agreements you made in the lease, you sort of execute them over it, depending on what's in there. But it also speaks more to just your relationship with your clients and customers and tenants. And it offers an opportunity to be creative in terms of what you're engaging on, what types of things that you're bringing up. So I'd like to hear from all of you or whoever wants to tell some stories on sort of the roadmap that and how you're engaging with tenants once they're in their space. What types of activities are you doing? What types of communication? What mediums are you using to communicate? Whether you found some to be more effective than others. What's really sort of getting tenants engaged when they're in there, and then vice versa. Any stories of working with tenants and different programs that they haven't been so on board with. So Elena, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Probably the funnest thing that we're doing in terms of tenant engagement right now is we have a campaign called Certs Up. So we actually learned that a lot of our properties, we work really hard to get these sustainability certifications like Energy Star and LEED and BREEAM, and they never get displayed at the property. And so we have this incentive where if the property team makes sure it actually physically gets displayed and onto their website and they send us a photo, we enter them into a raffle. And the teams can get, I think we do twice a year, $250 for each asset class, which is enough for like the property team to have lunch for everybody or whatever. So that's just a fun way to get it going. We've been expanding more into quarterly newsletters and stuff for our multi-tenant properties, and having tips and signage and stuff like that. We've actually been looking at some of the EPA Battle of the Buildings signage to provide to our properties, so there are some good resources there. And then on the triple net lease side, it is much more bespoke, right? As we talked about before, where we're really working with individual partners on different activities like on-site solar or waste management or whatever is relevant for that tenant. And then I was going to mention one other thing. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about on-site solar. We have a couple different structures of on-site solar we're doing with tenants in the larger properties.
Great. Lauren or Karen, any other thoughts, stories of sort of engagement and what you're doing as the tenant throughout their life cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I can piggyback on Elena and just say quickly a few other programs. One that, again, I know we'll talk about data in a minute, but we have rolled out a pretty big data gathering initiative using metering technology. The other one is, I kind of referenced this earlier. Aside from some kind of like campaign type work and communications work where we try to engage tenants on various topics throughout the year, another big one we've been partnering with them on is lighting retrofits. Again, kind of low hanging fruit, tends to have a really good payback. But we've been surprised to see how many assets we can tackle with an initiative like that. We've saved a tremendous amount of energy. What we did is we selected a national provider that has kind of done and is in the process of continuously doing lighting audits across our portfolio. We started in industrial, but we're expanding out to other asset types. and is doing, you know, audits, identifying opportunities for lighting, both, you know, upgrades and controls. And we're partnering with our tenants, again, using that lease language that we've discussed to implement that lighting. And it's nice because it's very impactful. It's easy to measure and quantify the savings from these programs. It's easy to talk about the payback with our tenants. And it's a you know, easy win on all sides to do this program, and it's such a large scale. The savings from it are truly impactful and tremendous and meaningful. So that's an exciting one as well.
I was just going to jump in and say, I think some of how we get into working with tenants, because most of them are there already, right? And so we're starting to work with existing tenants, is using waste. So waste is a huge tenant engagement tool, because it's a very visible tool to employees of what you stand for from a sustainability angle. We offer organics throughout our entire portfolio at no cost to our tenants. So as long as they have the bins, we will line them, we will clean it up, we will take it away, and we will send them reports and metrics. We perform waste audits annually at every one of our buildings. At least we do what we call sortathons, which are incredibly popular. So anybody who launches organics in their space, or who has done a massive like return to the office campaign, when they have a lot of their employees there, will go in person, somebody from my team, our waste consultant, and they set up in the pantry, and you sort of, when you go to throw out your salad bowl, they will talk to you about how to properly do that. Right? And then you get a compostable sticker or biodegradable sticker. It says you composted that day. I mean, we make it into a really sort of positive engagement, and that we found that if we can start to do things like that with tenants, then we start to find the people within the organizations really interested in sustainability, and how do we then further that. We've done with you guys sort of the treasure hunt through the tenant spaces. We've also done where we, because of the sub-metering structure we have, we in certain buildings will ask tenants to do energy challenges during Climate Week or during Earth Month now. And then what Elena does, we bring them lunch at the end. Whoever reduces energy the most that week, we will provide lunch and some more training. So we really try and make this a positive reinforcement that there's this financial benefit of reduction, but there's also this way of engaging your employees into the work that you're doing as an organization, and that you as an organization stand for what most employees are looking for these days, right? So we're just trying to reinforce their messaging almost already.
Yeah, and I think I have to put in a plug for Vornado, because you all have done a few tenant events in New York the last few years, and I've been lucky enough to be invited to a few of them. And I go there and I, you know, speak on what I think is really interested with Energy Star, and I cannot compete with these sessions on waste, because there's so much enthusiasm and so many questions and activities around sorting. Yeah, I think I need to get caught up on all that, because that seems to be a hot button issue. Great, thanks. So I'd like to shift forward a little bit. We have about 15 minutes, and I want to be able to ask some questions from the audience. So let's just move quickly to data and talk a little bit about, okay, so you have your leasing in place, you have your plan, you're executing, you're engaging with the tenants. Kind of full picture, how are you measuring this? How are you gathering either feedback, data to inform your own goals? Can anyone chime in? You speak to your approach to sort of data collection, what unique opportunities or barriers may exist, and where you go from there.
Yeah, I'll start here. So, as I've kind of mentioned, there are barriers to data collection. I think we're all aware of that. It feels like it should just be the simplest thing in the world. Everyone gets energy bills from a utility. Somehow it's incredibly complicated. And, like I mentioned, even with the green lease language, even with great partnerships with tenants, there's still not only the gathering of the data, but you want to make sure there's an accuracy and a completeness too. So when you're gathering it from so many different sources, it requires a lot of, quality checks and review and audit to make sure that you have the full buildings data, you know, and the data is accurately reported, you're not missing months here and there, things like that. We work through a variety of solutions to get data, and we've been proud to continuously increase our data coverage across our whole portfolio. One of the newest things we're doing, which we started last year, is implementing what we call shadow meters. They're whole building meters. It's been a really huge initiative for us. To date, we've installed approximately 150 meters. We started with electric and water. We're adding gas now. And it's been a pretty successful program. And, you know, it streamlines the ability to gather data. It makes it accurate. Much less audit work is required. And then we've had some quick wins, things like identifying water leaks, where the meters pay themselves back almost immediately, which is, you know, really great. It's not great the water leaks existed, but it's great that we identified them and we're quickly able to correct them. So things like that. We've also, you know, this has allowed us to partner more with our tenants. So we've been able to see the data better, and we're working on ways to give that data back to the tenants for their own use. And in a few instances, we've had tenants ask us about the program and see if they can actually do more nuanced metering inside. So they'll work with our vendor to install equipment level meters, and that's their own choice that they can make. We're really focused on the whole building. So that's been a big one for us.
Yeah, data is so exciting. You just got to get people a little taste of it, and they're interested in seeing more. Any other thoughts there?
No, I think you've mostly covered it. I mean, I think we're also working on going back through Energy Star right now and making sure all of our meters are accurately assigned to landlord versus tenant, especially in places where you have whole building data feeds. You have to go back and like back out the landlord meter to do that separation, and really thinking about where we can do sub-metering. And to your point, Karen, we've also identified, we had one property that we identified some water leaks at, and that was like a huge instant payback on that. So you can identify those kinds of things. Or we had another property where the Energy Star score just like tanked, and we saw that there were some like valves that were staying open overnight, right? So you can actually like really provide some value add to your tenants by just keeping an eye on all that data. So we are pretty like closely monitoring the data on a quarterly basis once we get it, and doing a lot of like outliers checks and cleansing and stuff on a quarterly basis with a consultant. That's probably the only thing I would add to what Karen already said.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize, I think there's a question around sort of how do you make the payback work? I think when you have examples of installing something and then seeing that there's been an issue and you see the immediate payback, it's a much easier business case to expand a program. So everything we try and do is we try and look at sort of a small test area to make the business case to then expand into a much broader perspective. And I think what we've seen with the sub-metering work that we do is that there's an immediate appreciation to understand better how the tenants are using their equipment and running their spaces, so that we can show them right away the savings.
Great, thanks. So I think we have one more sort of topic, and then a few questions that have been submitted. I did want to talk a little bit about the solar, because I think it comes up a lot with just the first thing anyone thinks of when they think of doing something green or greening their space. It's a lot more exciting than energy efficiency, unfortunately, for us at Energy Star. But it's a great initiative, but you kind of have to do it right. You have to know how it pencils out. So I was wondering if you all who have done solar projects can share a little bit around what types of things that you've discussed with the tenants, what leads to success for both on-site, if you actually have the space to do it, but then if tenants are interested in purchasing RECs, or you're doing that on behalf of the building, how does that all sort of come together around those discussions?
Yeah, I can jump in on this. We're really excited about on-site solar. I think the hard thing is that every jurisdiction has different rules of the game. And so you end up targeting certain states just because their setup is better for different deal structures. So a couple of the structures that we're working on, we have one retail center where we're doing virtual net metering, and I think this one's in California. We have the different tenants can actually sign on to the program, so we're putting it on the roof. The solar partner actually pays us rent for the energy that they sell back to the grid, or to the tenants, and then tenants can sign on to directly offtake that, which gives them green power, and it's also a slight discount, about 10% discount from what they would be paying from the grid. So it ends up being beneficial all around. And we basically have like a roof rent income that we get from that solar provider. We had another tenant, industrial tenant, that wanted to do their own solar because of their own sustainability goals, which we were very supportive of. But it required us to actually give permission. It was really important for us to do some structural review on that and make sure, we had to put in our own kind of in-kind resources to make sure that the design was structurally sound and that the roof was gonna, hold it and not have too many penetrations and all that kind of stuff. And we had to do a little bit of roof repair work to support that. But our cost was not that great to enable our tenant to be able to do what they wanted. And it really will contribute to like the stickiness of that tenant in the long term. The third example that I'll give is multifamily. I know we haven't talked that much about multifamily on this webinar, but community solar is a great opportunity to offer multifamily. And so we've also been playing around with having it be something that residents are offered when they sign their lease. And again, they can get like a slightly discounted electricity rate. And as you know, they're not technically getting green power, but they're contributing to green power being available. And so it's kind of a feel-good thing all around. And again, a benefit and a cost savings for the residents there. So you really have to kind of, unfortunately, segment it by, asset class and market. But when you find those sweet spots, they can work really well.
For sure. Yeah, Karen, go ahead. I know
Oh,
you have a lot of roof space. I don't know if you have anything to add
I was
on.
gonna say,
as a solar
similar to Elena, there's a lot of different deal structures out there. I think if,
Mhm.
if the listeners are not familiar, there's the landlord can own the solar array, the tenant can own it on the landlord's rooftop. You can have a third party developer own it and pay rent to the landlord and either sell the energy back to the tenant or not sell it back to the tenant and sell it out to the grid or through community solar. There's so many ways that these deals can work. We have done a handful of those different project types. There's some we haven't done yet of the project types. I think, when we talk to our tenants about this, though, some of the things that come up are obviously if we are going to sell the electricity back to the tenant, at what cost, who gets to keep the RECs is a negotiation point too, or if we're selling the RECs and, buying replacement RECs in another market. So there's that's always something. The REC is the financial mechanism that allows you to, for lack of a better term, take credit for the renewable energy. So it's not as simple as just getting the energy. It's also the REC and the retirement of the REC. And then also, just another thing I want to note is there's other, we think that you also don't want to just cover your entire roof of every single building and just tons of solar. That roof space is needed for other things, and as technologies develop, roof space continues to become an important part of the building. So also just kind of a balance between on-site solar and the other uses for rooftop space in industrial is important. And then there's also like privacy concerns, security concerns, maintenance, all of those things that are all kind of talking points when we work with our tenants on this type of deal.
Great. All right, we have a few minutes left. Lauren, unless you have something burning on solar you want to go for, I think we should take some of the audience questions that have come in. So one sort of is strategy based. When you think about engaging tenants and specifically actively engaging them in the energy use reduction process for their spaces, but also contributing to the whole building. What types of things are you looking at? This was so set in for Karen and Elena, but I think anyone can solve this. Do you have initiatives that are aimed at getting them to actually reduce their space? I mean, you can only count on so much for the tenant, but I imagine they do have to reduce in order to meet your goals. So I don't know if anyone has any additional thoughts on getting them to actually reduce energy and what seems to be effective.
I mean,
hard opener.
Go ahead, Karen.
I mean, Lauren, I think has a much more interesting, answer to this topic, which she started talking about a little bit on this call. The tenant, it's a partnership. It's not one party getting the other party to do something. It truly is a partnership. The tenants are our clients, and we rely on our tenants, and tenants rely on the landlord. So I would say, it's not about pushing them to do more. It's more about, if we have shared goals and we have a shared asset, like what benefits us all from an economic perspective and our sustainability goals. And I think that's where, and there's still so much to do that's in that bucket before we get to a place where we're talking about doing things that are just because of some other reason. And that's not where we are as an organization.
Yeah, I would agree. Look, we start with lighting replacements. We start with on-site solar for the big tenants, with waste. We haven't talked that much about water management, but there's some real low-hanging fruit with landscape water management as well. So we try to start with the really obvious wins, and a lot of it is about communication and relationship building, whether that's like the building-wide newsletter to a multi-tenant building or the more in-depth conversations one-on-one. The other thing I'll mention, particularly for the industrial and retail assets, is we've been using BREEAM in use technical assessments as a way to engage with tenants. It's basically like a physical property condition assessment, so you can do it even if you don't have all the energy data. And so we basically say, look, we're going to come in and do this assessment. Like, we basically have the right to periodically look at the condition, even in triple net lease properties. So it's totally within our right to go in and do the BREEAM assessment. But we say, like, we want to do this. Can you work with us? Can you provide us the information? And then when we get back the BREEAM results, we can actually show them, where the opportunities are in the property, and use that as the basis for conversation for future potential partnerships. But I think a lot of the big investment stuff does happen around lease signing or lease renewal, right? That is when folks are thinking about updating their space, or they're asking for some additional TI or improvements or whatever. It's in that like horse trading or the initial fit out, when folks are really putting in the big capital work, or like if you have some major equipment replacement, right? Like, we're not going to push replacing a piece of equipment unless it's at the end of useful life anyway. So it's really like keeping an eye on those opportunities.
Of course. We are at time. I'm hoping we could just have another couple of quick questions. I don't know if our panelists need to jump for 2 o'clock, but feel free to. So one that's came in is about submetering, and how do you get over the sort of first cost of installing submeters? I know this is more directed for Karen, because you're sort of actively looking to put those in with the tenants. So one, how do you get over sort of the scare of first costs of submeters, or justifying that? And then who actually is reading sort of the submeters every month?
Maybe that's Lauren. Yeah.
Lauren?
Yeah.
Yep, sure.
I can jump in there. I mean,
Either
we
or.
have a company that we work with 2 different providers. It depends on the building, who sort of have they provide submetering in that whole building, right? So the minute at least it's in the lease terms. We've put it in the lease terms that we are going to submeter it. There's a cost. We typically actually don't charge the tenant for the cost of installing a submeter. It's not very expensive, because we have invested in our buildings for the backbone. I mean, these are Class A office buildings, right? So we want to be able to provide this data. There is a monthly cost for having the submeter read and that data sent to the tenant, but it's not actually, it's very, very, very small. It's because they're across the entire building, right? The submeter company, the cost of a submeter reading is sort of is part of the bill that a tenant receives for their electricity usage that they have to pay. So there's a tiny fee for paying for that sub-meter use, and it means that they have full access to their data. We've not had anybody come back and say they didn't want to pay that very tiny line on their sub-meter bill. We've had much more engrossing conversations around the cost of waste hauling, but I would say that we, as part of the lease, we say there's going to be a sub-meter put in place. We explain what that sub-meter is going to do. We explain that we will pay for the cost of the sub-meter installation and that they will pay the maintenance cost or the monthly fee associated with it. And that seems to have worked. But it also allows us access to data. And so there's value to us in trying to make our buildings efficient. I think Elena and Karen have both made cases around when you find opportunities for savings and you can drive down, for us, it's the operating costs of a building. Tenants directly benefit from that. They directly benefit from having a more efficient space. So we show that we do those numbers and those calculations to make the business case that this data is helpful. Also, we're in the benefit of, local law 84, 88, and 97.
That's it. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. All right. I'm going to try to make this one a rapid fire. Hopefully we can get sort of a quick couple sentence answer from each panelist. Who does the tenant engagement at each building? Is this a property manager? Who's actually involved in rolling things out? And you can sort of list off the internal staff or just give a brief overview of how the information flows through.
Mostly the property teams. The asset managers are getting involved with lease negotiations and relationships with big tenants, with like the more senior points of contact with those tenants. And then the sustainability team might be providing resources and support like template newsletters and stuff like that.
Great. Lauren?
My team works to do a lot of this in-person engagement with the property managers, with the tenant service coordinators, with the chiefs. We utilize chief engineers in our buildings to help us a lot. So it really is, it's every person in that building that we're working with. We're asking the property teams to send out information, to put it in their elevators and all of the screens everywhere in the apps, that we have everything. And then we do a lot of the, as you've seen, a lot of the training, but we are also very local. So we have the benefit of that.
Well, great. Thanks so much. I'm so glad that, 5 or 10 years ago, the answer might have been just like, it's just me. I send all the emails and everything. I'm glad you all are expanding on your engagement initiatives. We have a number of other questions we got. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that, but we'll look to follow up. On Wednesday, we actually have a similar webinar on resident multifamily engagement. So feel free to join that if you're interested in that sector. But I want to thank our panelists here. Great discussion. Thank you so much for joining and appreciate everyone being on today as well.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.